I want you to imagine a chair. It's not an electric chair, bristling with wires and menace. It's not a throne of spikes or a grand, imposing seat of judgment. It's a simple, sturdy wooden chair, almost rustic in its construction. It has a high, straight back, a solid seat, and 4 legs planted firmly on the ground. It looks like something you might find in a monastery or a country kitchen. But behind the backrest, there is a thick wooden post. And passing through this post is a large, heavy screw with a T-shaped handle on one end. On the other end, the end that faces the chair, is a hinged metal collar, an iron circlet designed to fit snugly around a human neck. Now, imagine a person being led to this chair. They are not dragged kicking and screaming. The process is somber, deliberate, almost liturgical. Their hands and feet are bound. They are sat down, their back pressed firmly against the post. The iron collar is closed around their throat. A priest might be whispering final prayers. A crowd might be watching in hushed anticipation. An official gives a signal. A man, the executioner, steps behind the chair. He grips the T-shaped handle of the screw, and with a slow, steady motion he begins to turn it. The sound is a dry, grating creak as the threads of the screw bite into the wood. With each turn, the iron collar tightens around the condemned's neck, pressing them forward. But this device is not designed simply to strangle. In its most refined form, the front of the collar hides a secret. A sharp, pointed steel spike that is aligned perfectly with the base of the victim's skull. As the screw tightens, this spike is driven into the neck, between the cervical vertebrae, with the intention of severing the spinal cord and causing instantaneous death. A clean, scientific, and, above all, a humane death. This was the promise of the garrote, specifically the garroteville or vile garrote. For over 150 years, this was the official method of capital punishment in Spain, an instrument championed as a merciful and modern alternative to the barbarity of the hangman's noose or the headsman's axe. It was presented as a triumph of reason over ritual, a quiet, dignified exit from the world. But the history of the garrote is the story of a promise catastrophically broken. It is a story of how an instrument of supposed mercy became a symbol of political terror and unimaginable suffering. For every time the screw turned, there was a gamble. Would it be a swift, clean snap? Or would it be a slow, agonizing, and public strangulation, a gruesome failure of mechanics and a descent into the purest form of horror? Today, we will strap ourselves into the chilling history of the garrote. We will trace its evolution from a simple thug's weapon to a sophisticated machine of the state. We will explore the chillingly precise mechanics of how it was meant to kill and the grisly reality of how it so often failed. And we will journey into the 20th century, to the final, dark chapter of its use under the dictatorship of Francisco Franco, culminating in one of the most infamous and tragic executions in modern European history. This is the story of a humane killing machine and the dark truth that there is no clean way to take a human life. To understand the garrote, we must first understand the world that embraced it. Its story is not one of medieval darkness, but one born from the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, a period obsessed with reason, science, and reform. In the 18th and 19th centuries, thinkers across Europe began to question the nature of punishment. The old ways, the brutal, theatrical spectacles of breaking on the wheel, drawing and quartering, or burning at the stake were increasingly seen as barbaric and unbecoming of a civilized nation. The call was for a more humane form of capital punishment. In France, this search led to the invention of the guillotine, a machine designed to be swift, efficient, and egalitarian in its delivery of death. In Spain, the answer was the garrote. The word garrote itself simply means stick or cudgel in Spanish. Its origins are humble and violent. For centuries, It was a weapon of bandits and assassins, a simple cord looped around a victim's neck and twisted tight with a stick. It was a crude, effective method of silent strangulation. Its transition from a criminal's tool to an instrument of the state was a gradual one. For much of its history, Spain, like other European nations, had a hierarchy of death. The nobility, if sentenced to die, were granted the privilege of beheading by sword, a death seen as honorable. Common criminals were subjected to the vile or shameful death of hanging. The garrote entered the picture as a kind of middle ground, and eventually as a replacement for hanging. In 1832, King Ferdinand VII of Spain officially abolished hanging and decreed that the garrote would be the sole method of civilian capital punishment in the nation. The reasoning was rooted in this newfound desire for a less gruesome public spectacle. Hanging was unpredictable. A victim could dangle for minutes, struggling and convulsing, a sight deemed unseemly and distressing for the public. A beheading, if the executioner was not skilled, could be a bloody, horrifying mess. The garrote, in theory, offered a solution. It was clean. There was little to no blood. The victim was seated, offering a semblance of dignity, and the mechanical action of the screw promised a degree of scientific precision and control. It was the state imposing order even in the act of killing. Over time, the device itself was refined, becoming more and more of a machine. The simple stick and cord evolved into the iron collar and screw mechanism. This was the garrote vil, the vile garrote, so named because it was the method used for common criminals, distinguishing it from the theoretical, more noble death of beheading, which was, by then, almost never practiced. The ultimate refinement came with the addition of that small, sharp spike at the front, known in Catalan as el corbati, the little tie. This innovation, introduced in the late 19th century, was the key to the garrote's claim of humanity. The goal was no longer strangulation. The goal was a high-speed, clinical severing of the spinal cord at the base of the brainstem, what is sometimes called a hangman's fracture. If it worked correctly, death would be virtually instantaneous. The brain would be disconnected from the body, and consciousness would cease in a fraction of a second. This was the theory, a perfect, painless death delivered by a machine, a testament to a modern, rational, and humane state. The reality, however, was often a very different story. The effectiveness of this complex killing machine depended entirely on a terrifying set of variables: the skill of the executioner, the anatomy of the condemned, and the condition of the device itself. When any one of these variables was off, the promise of a humane death collapsed into a nightmare of slow, agonizing suffocation. Let's dissect the mechanics of failure. The executioner, or verdugo in Spanish, was not a highly trained medical professional. He was often a low-status individual, a social outcast who took the job out of desperation. His understanding of human anatomy was likely non-existent. His only training was on the job. He had to correctly position the spike at the precise point between the vertebrae. A few millimeters too high, and it would strike the solid bone of the skull. A few millimeters too low, and it would miss the spinal cord, embedding itself uselessly in the thick muscles of the neck. The victim's physique also played a crucial role. A person with a thick, muscular neck or one who was overweight presented a difficult target. The spike might not be long enough, or the force of the screw might not be sufficient to penetrate the tissue and reach the spinal column. And then there was the machine itself. The garrote was not a mass-produced item. Each one was handmade. The screw could wear down, the collar could warp. Without proper maintenance, the device could fail at the critical moment. When it failed, the result was not a clean break, but a crude, brutal crushing. The spike would tear through muscle and tissue, and the collar would constrict the windpipe and the carotid arteries. The victim would die, but not instantly. They would die of strangulation, their face turning purple, their eyes bulging from their sockets, their body convulsing against the restraints as they fought for air. The process could take several minutes, an eternity for the condemned and for those forced to watch. The executioner, realizing the spinal cord had not been severed, would have to continue turning the screw, crushing the larynx and the neck bones in a desperate attempt to finish the job. Sometimes they would climb onto the chair, using their own body weight to try and force the mechanism to work, or even physically break the victim's neck. The quiet, dignified scientific execution would devolve into a gruesome, frantic, and very public display of brute force. The promise of mercy was revealed to be a lottery of death, where the prize was a quick end, and the cost of losing was several minutes of unimaginable agony. This was the dark secret at the heart of the garrote. It was a machine that offered the possibility of a perfect death, but it provided no guarantee against a perfect hell. The execution by garrote was far more than just the final, violent turning of a screw. It was a deeply ingrained and highly ritualized piece of public theater, a social and religious drama that played out over hours, sometimes days. To understand its full impact, we must look beyond the mechanics of the machine and examine the ceremony that surrounded it. The process began after the sentence of death was confirmed. The condemned was transferred to a special cell, often located next to the prison chapel, known as the capilla. Here, they would spend their final 24 to 48 hours. They would not be left alone. They were constantly attended by priests and members of a religious brotherhood, a cafradia. These were lay organizations, often centuries old, whose charitable mission included comforting the condemned in their final hours and ensuring they died in a state of grace. Dressed in hooded robes that hid their faces, these figures created an atmosphere of pervasive, anonymous piety. Their goal was to bring the prisoner to a state of repentance, to secure their confession, and to prepare their soul for its meeting with God. This period was a form of intense psychological pressure. The prisoner was surrounded by the symbols of death and salvation: crucifixes, candles, the constant murmur of prayers. They were offered food and wine, small comforts in the face of annihilation. For the authorities, a prisoner who went to their death calmly and repentantly was a victory. It affirmed the justice of the sentence and the moral order of the state. On the day of the execution, the final act of the drama began. A procession would form. The condemned, often dressed in a simple tunic, would be led from the prison. They would be flanked by the hooded brothers of the cafradia and the priests. In some cases, a town crier would walk ahead, announcing the name of the condemned and the crimes for which they were to be executed. The procession would slowly make its way through the streets to the place of execution, which was often a public square or a platform erected for the occasion. The crowd was an essential part of the ritual. Executions were public holidays, drawing thousands of spectators. They were a form of grim entertainment, a moral lesson, and a raw display of state power rolled into one. People would jostle for the best view, some climbing onto rooftops or balconies. The atmosphere would be a strange mixture of festive and somber. At the center of this spectacle was the chair, the garrote village, and next to it the figure of the verdugo, the executioner. The verdugo was a paradox, a figure of immense power at the moment of execution, but a social pariah in everyday life. The job was often passed down within families. They were seen as unclean, tainted by their association with death. They were often forced to live on the outskirts of town and were shunned by their neighbors. Their presence at the execution was a focal point of fear and fascination. The final moments were thick with ritual. The condemned would be seated in the chair. The priest would offer a final blessing, sometimes holding a crucifix for them to kiss. The sentence would be read aloud one last time. Then, the verdugo would step forward to do his work. He would position the collar, check the alignment, and place his hands on the screw. This was the moment of truth, the moment the crowd had been waiting for. A hush would fall. The only sound would be the creak of the screw and, perhaps, the final words of the condemned. And then the outcome, either a sudden, sharp slump of the body, signaling a successful execution, or the beginning of the horrifying, prolonged struggle of a botched one. After death was confirmed by a doctor, the body would often be left on display for a period of time, a final warning to the populace. The Cofradia would then claim the body and ensure it received a Christian burial, their final act of charity. This entire process from the chapel to the procession to the public death and burial was designed to reinforce the power of the state and the church. It was a message that while the state could take your life, the church could still save your soul. It transformed a simple act of killing into a profound moral and social statement. But this ritualized, almost medieval system of public execution survived deep into the 20th century. And it was in its final decades that the garrote would shed its identity as a tool of common justice and become something far more sinister, a weapon of political terror used by one of Europe's most enduring dictatorships to crush its enemies. It is in this modern context that the garrote would perform its last and most infamous acts. The Spanish Civil War of the 1930s was a brutal, ideological conflict that tore the country apart. When the dust settled in 1939, General Francisco Franco emerged as the victor, establishing a right-wing, nationalist dictatorship that would rule Spain for nearly 4 decades. Franco's regime was built on a foundation of fierce traditionalism, Catholic nationalism, and the ruthless suppression of all political dissent. In this new Spain, the garrote was not just a tool of the justice system. It became a potent political symbol. It represented a return to a traditional Spanish order, a rejection of the liberal and leftist ideologies that Franco had defeated. It was a tangible link to a romanticized pre-modern past, a stark and brutal instrument in an age of growing modernity. For the regime, the garrote was a way of saying, "We are not like the rest of Europe. We have our own ways, and this is what we do to traitors." Throughout the Franco years, the garrote was used to execute political opponents, communists, socialists, and, most notably, anarchists. The anarchist movement had been particularly strong in Spain, especially in Catalonia, and it was a primary target of Franco's repression. For the regime, executing an anarchist with the garrote was a deeply symbolic act. It was the ultimate imposition of state authority onto a political ideology that rejected the state in all its forms. This brings us to the final tragic chapter in the garrote's long and bloody history, the story of its last victims, and in particular, the story of a young Catalan anarchist whose death would shake the world and become a rallying cry against a dying dictatorship. His name was Salvador Puig Antich. Puig Antich was born in 1948, a child of the post-war generation. He came of age in the 1960s, a time of global student protest and radical politics. He was an idealist, drawn to the anti-authoritarian and revolutionary ideas of anarchism. He joined a clandestine group called the Iberian Liberation Movement, MIL, a small, militant anarchist organization that carried out bank robberies, which they called expropriations, to fund their anti-capitalist, anti-Franco activities. They were young, reckless, and committed to their cause. In September 1973, the police closed in on the MIL. In a chaotic shootout in a Barcelona doorway, a 23-year-old police officer named Francisco Anguiz Barragan was killed. Puig Antich was also shot and severely wounded. He was captured and charged with the officer's murder. His trial was a legal travesty. It was held in a military court, not a civilian one. The evidence was contradictory and dubious. It was unclear who had fired the fatal shots in the chaotic exchange. But the outcome was never in doubt. The Franco regime needed to make an example. Puig Antich, the anarchist bank robber and cop killer, was the perfect scapegoat. He was found guilty and sentenced to death by Garrote. The sentence sparked a wave of international protest. Governments across Europe, human rights organizations like Amnesty International, and even Pope Paul VI pleaded with Franco for clemency. The case became a symbol of the brutality and injustice of the Spanish dictatorship, which by the early 1970s was an anachronism in a democratic Western Europe. But Franco would not be moved. To grant clemency would be to show weakness. The sentence would be carried out. On the morning of March 2, 1974, inside the courtyard of Barcelona's Modelo prison, Salvador Puig, 25 years old, was led to the Garrote. The executioner assigned to the task was Antonio López Sierra, a man who was known to be a heavy drinker and who was reportedly ill at the time. The machine itself was old, the procedure unrehearsed. What happened next is the ultimate, horrifying refutation of the Garrote's claim to humanity. Puig was seated in the chair. His lawyers, who were present, described the scene. The executioner struggled to position the collar correctly. When he began to turn the screw, it didn't work as intended. The spike failed to sever the spinal cord. Instead of a quick death, Salvador Puig was slowly and agonizingly strangled. His lawyers reported that the ordeal lasted for nearly 20 minutes. They could hear the horrifying sounds of his choking, the cracking of his neck bones. The executioner, in a panic, reportedly kept turning the screw, crushing his victim's neck in a desperate, brutal effort to complete the execution. It was not a clean, scientific, or dignified death. It was a grotesque, botched spectacle of suffering, a final, terrible proof of the Garrote's true nature. On the very same day, in another prison in Tarragona, another man, a German drifter named George Michael Welzel, often referred to by the incorrect name Heinz Shea, was also executed by Garrote for the murder of a police officer. His execution was reportedly just as slow and agonizing. This was a calculated act by the regime to show that this was not about a single political case, but about the unyielding application of Spanish law. The executions of Salvador Puig and George Michael Welzel were the last times the Garrote was ever used in Spain or anywhere in the world. They were the final, brutal punctuation mark on a history that spanned centuries. The death of Salvador Puig sent shockwaves across Spain and the world. Far from being a display of the regime's strength, it became a potent symbol of its moral bankruptcy and brutal desperation. The image of the young, handsome anarchist, martyred by an archaic torture device, became an icon for the anti-Franco opposition. His death helped to galvanize the final push for democracy. Just over a year and a half later, in November 1975, Francisco Franco died. Spain began its remarkable and peaceful transition to democracy. One of the first acts of the new, democratic government was to address the legacy of the past. In 1978, the new Spanish Constitution officially abolished the death penalty. The Garrote, the machine that had been the state's ultimate sanction for 146 years, was formally and permanently retired. Today, the Garrote exists only as a museum artifact and a ghost in the Spanish cultural memory. It sits silently in glass cases, a stark wooden and iron reminder of a darker time. Its story is a complex one, a journey from a bandit's weapon to an Enlightenment-era tool of humane justice, and finally, to a 20th century instrument of political terror. What is the ultimate legacy of the Garrote? It serves as a powerful and deeply unsettling case study in the long and fraught history of capital punishment. It exposes the fallacy of the search for a humane way to kill. The Garrote, with its scientific pretensions and its promise of a swift, painless death, was perhaps the most ambitious attempt to create such a method. And its history is a chronicle of its spectacular failure. It proves that when the state takes on the power to execute its citizens, it can never fully control the messy, unpredictable, and often horrifying reality of the act itself. The story of the garrote is a cautionary tale. It warns us about the dangers of giving the state the power to decide who lives and who dies. It reminds us that instruments of death, no matter how they are justified, can easily become tools of political repression. And it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the line between justice and vengeance, between a clinical procedure and a brutal act of torture, can be as thin as the turn of a screw. The creak of the garrote has been silenced forever, but its history echoes on, a somber and necessary reminder of the state's capacity for cruelty, and of the long, difficult, and ongoing struggle for a more just and truly humane world. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the dark history of the garrote. To understand our present, we must be willing to confront the most difficult and unsettling parts of our past. If this exploration of capital punishment, political history, and the story of Salvador Puig Antich has given you a new perspective, please consider supporting our work. You can do so by liking this video, subscribing to the channel for more historical deep dives, and activating notifications so you never miss a new story. But the most important thing is the conversation we have now. The garrote was justified as humane. Today, methods like lethal injection face similar debates about their effectiveness and cruelty. What does the story of the garrote teach us about the modern death penalty? And why do you think this particular instrument became so deeply intertwined with the identity of Spain? Please share your thoughts, your questions, and your insights in the comments section below. History is not just about listening to stories. It's about debating what they mean. Thank you for listening.